Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Restoring the Past. In this episode, I'm going to try to answer a question I have always had since I was a child. Did knights really wear shining armor? Which picture do you think is more accurate? Well, the short answer to this question is for the most part, no. But as we shall see, the answer is complicated, since it is both yes and no at times. But more often, it was no. Contrary to popular belief, knights did not wear highly polished, shining armor as the appearance of choice on European battlefields. I know. This might be an unpopular view, and some people might flat out refuse to believe it. But to help explain why this is the case, I'm going to examine armor that was made between the 13th to 17th century. I chose this vast time frame because it encompasses the height of medieval warfare, as well as the Renaissance period that followed, before firearms made armor obsolete. I also chose such a vast historical spread because it demonstrates that the myth of the knight in shining armor is not limited to a very narrow or specific time frame, but is rather a universal theme across the board. Everywhere I look, I find knights and other combatants dressed in suits of armor that were anything but shiny. Recent scholarship on the subject and restoration efforts on historic items, which I will discuss towards the end of the video, has only reaffirmed my belief that the knight in shining armor was a rare sight on the battlefield. European knights throughout history, for various reasons which will be discussed here, did not wear shining armor, or white armor as it was known, as the dominant form of armor finish. I know this likely comes as a huge shock to most people, but the evidence has always been there. But it has often been cast aside as an unusual phenomenon when encountered, or just simply ignored, because it didn't conform to the modern image of what a medieval knight should look like. After all, how many of you picture a knight encased in gray, pale gray, dark gray, brown, russet, red, vermilion, blue, dark blue, midnight blue, Botticelli blue, pale blue, green, yellow, gold, and black, just to name a few colors? So strong is the idea of a knight in shining armor that I also struggled to come to terms with this realization that knights did not often wear it. It should not have been such a struggle though, since the evidence of colored finishes are everywhere on antique arms and armor, even on the earliest examples. Sometimes, that proof is glaringly obvious and literally stares us in the face when looking at period books, drawings, manuscripts, illuminations, and carvings, all depicting and describing armor, as well as the armor itself. In other instances, it's not so obvious and requires hands-on experience with the small samples of existing physical evidence that remains unaltered. The key word here is unaltered, because a lot of the remaining historical armor on display today no longer retains its original finish and bears little resemblance to when it was first made. The absence of these original finishes has helped perpetuate the myth of the knight in shining armor and the prevailing belief that white armor dominated the battlefield. When medieval peasants saw knights, they would exclaim, "Iron, iron," everywhere. But that did not mean that iron was polished like a mirror. Instead, period armor was likely a very colorful sight that few of us would associate with today, given our deeply ingrained view of how we think a knight should appear. We imagine a knight to be encased from head to foot in highly polished steel that would reflect light in its surroundings. But what if this popular conception is wrong, or at least mostly wrong? In fact, as we shall see, white armor may have been a rare sight or absent completely, depending on the historical time frame. So you might be asking yourself, how can this be? Where does all this color come from, and how did it get on steel? Well, this shouldn't come as a total surprise, because the idea of it is still with us today in the form of bluing firearms. While colored armor did not get its finish from chemical solutions in a bottle, the idea behind it remains the same. Most of the vivid colors found on armor is the result of the manufacturing process used to create the objects themselves, i.e., the heat of the forge. A lot of armor achieved its color through oxide finishes, which were achieved by heat treating armor at various temperatures, high temperatures, to physically change the color of the metal. But other techniques and methods were used too, such as painting, varnishing, lacquering, and covering the metal with various textiles or leather. This picture gives us a sample of some of the colors which can be achieved by heat treating the steel to a specific temperature. Coloring armor in all of its forms was not just for aesthetic purposes. It also served a vital utilitarian purpose, like bluing a firearm, which was to protect the armor and steel from rusting. Anyone who has experience in restoration, conservation, or manufacturing knows how quickly steel starts to rust unless it's treated in some way, either with an oxide finish or some other means of providing a protective coat over the metal. Remember that we're talking about a time when mass production did not exist. Producing arms and armor was a laborious task, and artisans did everything they could to ensure their products were protected from the elements, so they maintained their functionality and beauty. This is one of the main reasons why shiny white armor was so rare. It simply wasn't practical. The highly polished steel was wide open to the ravages of the elements and would start rusting immediately. It would have taken a great deal of time to constantly have to polish this armor in order to maintain some type of professional appearance, and all the while reducing its defensive capabilities with every sliver of steel polished away to achieve it. That's the main reason why the white armor we associate with knights today was not commonplace during the actual medieval and Renaissance periods. Yes, there are historical accounts of white metal being used as a finish, but these same accounts also mention the problematic need of constant oiling and polishing care. When a white finish was applied to armor, it was specifically mentioned as a special type of finish as opposed to a more common standard of how armor should appear. To help illustrate how rare white armor was, between August 27th and 28th, 1478, Giovanni Attendolo conducted an inventory of 2,665 armors listed at the Castle of Pavia Armory in Lombardy, Italy, for Bona of Savoy, Duchess of Milan. During that extensive review, there is only one mention of white armor, which related to a helmet described as a small white sallet with a gilded border. The inventory goes on to list the rest as black or of munition type. Munition type being those carried by common soldiers, which has some type of non-white finish. Much of the supporting evidence for armor during the 13th and 14th centuries mainly comes from paintings, illuminations, books, carvings, and a few surviving pieces of the armor itself. Armor made during the 13th and 14th centuries is incredibly rare because it was a valuable source of material, and old armor was frequently recycled, cut up into pieces, and reforged into new products which conformed with later fashions, and when it fell out of use, was sold off as scrap. One example of this trend comes from 1683, when the armories of the Tower of London sold unserviceable metal of unknown age by weight, which included backs, breasts, tilting armor, burgonets, main guards, and pass guards. In all, 9 tons, 3 squares, 19 pounds. This is more than 9.19 metric tons of armor. So the less material there is today, and the older it is, the lower the odds of it surviving with its original finish. But, as we shall see, some of it did make it. As we move later and later into the centuries, I won't need to rely as much upon paintings, illuminations, carvings, or books to prove that colored armor was mainstream, since there are enough surviving examples of authentic armor to prove this point on their own. So, let's kick things off and begin by examining armor in the 13th century. In order to get a better understanding of this, let's take a look at some historical artwork to see how arms and armor was portrayed by those who actually saw it firsthand in its original state. There are many period works that provide us with tangible examples of what most armor originally looked like. Even as far back as the 13th century, knights in armor are portrayed in a wide variety of colorful finishes. Reading historical texts as a child and seeing how armor was depicted in them made me begin to question the idea of white armor, because what I read and saw in historical texts did not line up with what I was seeing on TV or popular armor on display in museums. Take this ink on parchment illumination from the mid-1200s, depicting a knight on horseback. Notice how the sword, chainmail, and helmet are all shown in different colors. The biggest question now becomes not one of whether or not the artwork portrays colorful armor, but trying to identify exactly which type of oxide finish was used. The next series of early depictions of knights in armor all tell a similar story, and shows how colorful the arms and armor of the 13th century were. We can see red, russet, green, gray, blue, black, and gold. Take special note of this picture, featuring Ulrich von Liechtenstein wearing a helmet with an effigy of the goddess Venus. Note that he is wearing a gold helmet and wielding a black or possibly midnight blue sword. The next 13th century illumination shows a knight in vibrant blue oxide finished armor. The artist also chose to make a clear distinction of color between the blue oxide finish of the armor and the blue surcoat. The armor and helmet are a paler shade of blue, which demonstrates that the artist was keenly aware of the two different shades of blue present on this warrior. Many of the helms depicted in period artwork from the 13th century achieved their color through a combination of oxide finishes, gilding, or paint. Painted armor is interesting because it allowed for greater flexibility to more accurately match a knight's armor with their household colors and coats of arms. For example, sometimes the helms of knights were painted in order to match family arms, as seen here in this period painting depicting the siege of Jerusalem. We can see more examples of painted helms in the illuminations of Count Otto von Bottenlaben from around 1206, and Sir Reimar der Alt in the 13th century. The next three pictures are modern, but they portray 13th century knights in armor with painted helmets, oxide finish mail, and other painted components. These recent renderings of knights also makes me believe that people are beginning to change their attitude towards historic armor and are becoming increasingly aware of the fact that armor was rarely white. Thanks to surviving traces of painted finishes on some historic pieces, we have a better idea of the process involved in painting helms and other pieces of armor. I'll discuss this process in more detail when we examine armor from the 14th century, since there are some period examples of armor which still retains part of their original painted finish. We have just seen a few 13th century paintings and illuminations showing knights with colored arms and armor. Now let's take a look at the imperial ceremonial sword of Frederick II from 1220 to see if its finish matches what we just saw on paper. What you see is not a trick of the light or reflection to make the sword look darker than it is. There is no manipulation involved here. Just look at the edges of the blade and see how those areas are white while the center of the blade is midnight blue. The midnight blue oxide finish on this sword is very apparent and would have been one type of oxide finish which was applied to armor. Just imagine how impressive armor finished in this way would have appeared. As we leave the 13th century and enter the 14th century, the historic depiction of armor remains the same, that is to say, very colorful. In this scene depicting the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385, there is a complete absence of white armor on both the Castilian and Portuguese sides. This painting is interesting because the artist used silver for the horse and white on the flags. So the fact that dark blue or black was used for the armor was most certainly deliberate. It also shows that the color used to portray armor in this painting was not something else originally, which might have faded or changed over time, because the silver and white remain vibrant and clear. The absence of white armor continues in the next series of period works portraying the Battle of Crécy and Agincourt. These battles represent the epitome of medieval warfare, and had thousands of knights concentrated in a single area at one time. With so many knights present on the field of battle, one would expect to see rows of combatants encased in a wall of glittering steel. But instead, the historical depictions of the battles shows that white armor was completely missing. White armor is also absent in this period illumination, depicting the siege of Calais. Dark blue, gray, and black are the only colors used by the artist to paint the arms and armor present during the siege. The armor as well as the weapons are shown in colors ranging from midnight blue, russet, gray, black, and gold. Interestingly, the use of white and silver are also present, suggesting that once again the artist was aware of these colors, but chose not to paint white armor, because that is not what he saw. The artist was competent, and knew that the armor was not white, and therefore omitted it on purpose from his work. The next two period scenes continues to demonstrate that 14th century armor still had colorful oxide finishes, but was now also being covered with textiles, such as velvet, cloth, or leather, riveted over plates. The last illumination used in this century example depicts Albrecht Marshal von Rapperswil shattering a lance against an opponent. But what really makes this interesting is the color of the armor. Look carefully at Marshal's great helm, which is worn with a pale blue oxide bever. This pale blue oxide contrasts with the dark gray of the helm and van plates of the warrior's lance and mail. There is no doubt the use of pale blue here is intentional. If the illustrated artwork is not enough to convince people that white armor was not as common as previously thought, then let's take a look at some of the actual armor and see the color for ourselves. This German bassinet from 1325 still retains faint traces of Botticelli blue all over the skull. The helm was restored in the very early 20th century, and during this restoration, parts of the skull cap were painted pale blue, perhaps to imitate the traces of original blue oxide finish that might have been more prevalent, but has since been largely lost or removed. Although the blue oxide finish is not as bright as it once was, it nonetheless remains. I have digitally enhanced the oxide finish on the helmet to try to give us a better idea of what it might have looked like prior to the 20th century restoration, based upon the paint samples. The enhancement also shows that there is more oxide finish remaining than it first appears, but is simply difficult to see with the naked eye. It is possible that if more armor were subjugated to the same treatment, then they too would show evidence of original oxide finish, which is no longer visible and believed to be lost. This late 14th century visored bassinet, despite its current white appearance, offers clues to what it looked like originally. If we take a close look around the staple area where the visor is attached, we can see the original blue oxide finish still clinging to recessed portions of decoration, as well as the pierced studs along the rim which held the aventail. The aventail is a defensive mail covering the lower face, neck, and shoulders. The next set of pictures features another late 14th century visored bassinet, this time with an aventail. As we have previously seen, we know that armor was painted in the 13th century and continued until the end of the 14th century. An inventory conducted by the Privy Wardrobe of England in 1344 describes royal arms painted on a pair of upper vambraces and a helmet. In the report it's going to talk about lunettes, and lunettes were some sort of small shoulder defense like aillettes or besigues. 42 pairs of vambraces, of which one pair is of brass and one pair is of iron, with the coutures and lunettes painted with the arms of England. 63 helmets, of which 55 are for war, and one helmet painted with the old arms of England. The Leiden vambrace provides a very rare and interesting example of how some painted surfaces were applied to plate and leather armor. Painted hardened leather battlefield armor continued to be worn on the limbs of knights into the third quarter of the century, but it was being reinforced with iron or steel strips, fastened into place by rows of rivets, such as in this 14th century example. We can still see the traces of gesso, used as a base to make the area smooth, as well as providing a bonding agent for painting on the outer surface. This piece of vambrace was reconstructed by Chris Dobson for the Leiden Museums, and shows what the piece would have looked like when new. It seems that painting battlefield armor largely fell out of fashion for knights by the end of the 14th century, but as we shall see later on, it did not completely disappear. Despite its sporadic and continued use throughout the ages, one of the last mentions of it during its former heydays comes from a painted helm in the Datini archive, which is described in 1398 as an iron jousting helm, short, old, painted vermilion, valued at 1 florin. Although this marked the end of the widespread use of painted armor, it did nothing to discourage the use of colored armor. The only difference now is how that color was achieved. As we begin to examine armor in the 15th century, it's important to keep in mind when talking about different eras, especially the time at the beginning or end, that there was seldom a sudden and very clean break to distinguish one time frame from another. This is especially true when it comes to arms and armor, because normally there was a transition period where some older techniques or fashions were carried over into a new era and vice versa. This temporal buffer zone applied to painted armor because it lingered on in certain environments. Hardened leather horse armor in particular appears to have provided a suitable canvas for painted decoration beginning in the 14th century. There is a clear description of coat of arms being applied to horse armor in a 1417-18 inventory of goods undertaken for the house of Giovanni di Bicci di Medici in Florence. The inventory describes 3 hardened leather horse armors as follows: an old strongbox, inside which is 1 pair of bards, with the chevron and side plates of hardened leather covered with gold with the arms displayed. 2 pairs of leather bards, with the side plates with the arms displayed. Although we can move on from paint as a mass means of adding color to armor, the dominance of colored armor did not diminish in the 15th century. A 15th century Flemish miniature of a jousting scene appears in an edition of Jean Froissart's Chronicles, written during the previous century. Note the gray oxide finish on the armor, as opposed to silver or white. When we take a look at some of the illuminations contained in the Gideon de Trésigny's from the 15th century, it is evident that the armor captured in these pages is anything but white. We see a wide range of colors and finishes, ranging from midnight blue to vermilion and gilded pieces, with sections of trimming contrasting with the main plates, as well as various fabric-covered armors, with gold embroidery and gilded sallets and burgonets. Looking at all the vibrant and lavish colors, you might think these individuals are celebrating at a carnival if it weren't for the slaughter taking place. White armor is also absent from this representation of the siege of Jerusalem. In this rendition of the Battle of Castillon, we can see midnight blue and grey oxide armor, and even a few sets of completely and partially gilded examples. The use of textiles and leather to color large pieces of plate is also illustrated here. The two knights jousting in this painting feature 3 different kinds of colors, using 3 different techniques to achieve it. Some of the plates are done in a midnight blue oxide finish, some have been gold gilded, and other pieces have been covered in textiles or leather. This highly detailed and large artwork is exceptional in its quality of execution and state of preservation. Thanks to Delsalio's painstaking attention to detail, we have a captivating 15th century piece that tells us many things about the style and color of armor used at this time. It's very telling for a number of reasons. First, there is not a single piece of white armor to be found amongst all of these armored warriors and knights. Many of the knights are wearing armor with a midnight blue oxide finish with gilded decorative elements and gilded mail. Some have what appears to be colorful cloth, velvet, or leather covering the steel. There are a few knights in red, russet, and gilded armor, and many are wearing completely gilded helmets. This famous ink and watercolor tinted image by Nuremberg artist Albrecht Dürer offers more insight to the colors and materials found on armor during this period. It is not some fantasy depiction of a knight in armor. It is meant to be an actual representation of how armor appeared, because Albrecht wrote above the figure, "This was the armor of the time in Germany." The letters WA are embroidered in white to contrast with the brown textile cover of his sallet, which matches the surcoat he is wearing over his cuirass. The tint of watercolor suggests that the knight's armor is finished in Botticelli blue oxide. The next 2 pictures show that regardless of whether or not the conflict was on land or sea, if armor was required, the color of it, or should I say the various colors of it, remain the same. It could even be argued that the need for a colored oxide finish of some kind was even more important at sea in order to give armor that extra layer of protection from rust due to the greater exposure of oxidizing elements found in salt water. I will talk a little more about this in the next century, since refurbishing armor exposed to prolonged journeys at sea required special attention to recondition them and get them back into active service. The last 2 things I wanted to show you before we start to examine 15th century armor is how woodcarvers portrayed knights during this period. Following the trend, even woodworkers chose to finish many period carvings depicting knights in polychrome armor as seen here in grey, russet, partial gilding, and fully gilded colors. When we take a look at armor from this period, we once again encounter painted examples in the early part of the century. This great bassinet from the early 1400s shows that painted armor was still around, but might have been mainly applied in a tournament setting. The original colors on this great bassinet would have been bright red and white, but the varnish applied over them has discolored over time, and now makes everything appear darker. The next pictures of hammer-finished black sallets from the end of the 15th century shows how painting persisted as a means of adding color to armor. The first sallet is painted with the repeated designs of the Jerusalem cross, also known as the 5-fold cross and crosslets. Originally the paint would have been white, to contrast sharply with the black oxidized finish of the armor, but the white paint has turned yellow over the centuries. The second sallet appears to feature a coat of arms for its decorated composition. Painted helmets like these, or livery painted helmets, since they were often paired with matching livery jackets or surcoats, seem to have been widespread in the German states, since there are several historical examples showing large squadrons of knights on the battlefield with these types of painted helmets. The Battle in the Forest, painted in 1502, shows combatants appearing this way, but by 1510 to 15, painted helmets were increasingly rare on European battlefields. Another means of achieving colorful armor was by covering the metal with various fabrics such as velvet, silk, leather, linen, or textiles. To better illustrate this, let's take a look at this suit of armor. This armor was assembled in the 1920s using various pieces which were discovered in the ruins of the Venetian fortress of Chalcic on the Greek island of Euboea, which had fallen to the Turks in 1470. The purpose of this assembled armor was to present a full armor in the style worn around 1400, which is a period from which no complete armors exist. I love this time period, and we can see the early form of a brigandine, which is a torso defense constructed of numerous overlapping plates, riveted inside a doublet, with two large breastplates and brass borders at the edge of the exposed plates. The velvet covering the brigandine dates from the early 20th century, but is correct in depicting how the brigandine would have appeared when new. Portions of the brass at the top edge of the left cuisse, the lower edges of the right greave, and the visor are genuine. The remainder is restored. The helmet, a visored bassinet, is associated with the armor. Next, we have this impressive breastplate, which is covered in a silk velvet and linen material in order to give the breastplate some color. The velvet on the breastplate would have been bright red originally and was applied over a coarse linen. The fixtures on the breastplate and other exposed components are finished with a rusted gray oxide. The breastplate was likely used in a tournament setting, as is evidenced by the holes in the center for mounting a reinforcing breastplate, and the upper right shoulder area, which would have likely supported a lance rest. The next piece clearly illustrates that helmets were also covered in fabrics, textiles, or leather in order to provide a splash of color. This ornate mid-15th century sallet was executed in the Venetian style and was covered in textiles to give the armor more color and personality. This particular sallet is covered in red velvet, which likely dates to the 17th century. Having examined a few examples of painted and fabric-covered armor, let's take a closer look at armor which achieved their color during the manufacturing process itself. It's important to remember, however, that what remains of most original finishes, especially those found on early armor, can be very hard to find. We need to keep this in mind and manage our expectations, but when we do find the traces that remain, try imagining this applied to the entire piece. This armet from 1470 shows a surviving pale blue oxide finish around the left side of the brow reinforce and along the rear lower edge of the right cheek piece. The color in the picture may appear like a dull gray, but it's more blue firsthand. There are also traces of the oxide finish around the steel band, which once held on the can mail and the rivets attaching it. I saw this piece up close when I visited the Wallace collection this year, and it was very impressive. The original finish really pops compared to the rest of the helmet. Oxide finished armor came in many colors, some of which were not overly colorful. But most importantly, were not white either. Some of these oxide finishes have a grayish color, known as russet gray or other forms of gray. At first glance, some of the oxide finishes might appear as white armor that is simply old or dirty, but a close-up picture of a section of backplate field armor from Innsbruck, Austria, shows that the armorsmith deliberately made this armor to look gray as opposed to white. The gray oxide finish was preserved in one section of the backplate because the lumbar plate fitted over this area and sheltered this section of original finish from being removed by polishing. This heavily restored armet from around 1490 to 1500 provides us with a glimpse of what a russet gray oxide finish would have originally looked like. We don't have to push the imagination very far with this little gem of a visored bassinet. The gray or blue oxide finish here is astounding and gives this early bassinet a sophisticated appearance. More well-preserved traces of the original finish appears in this fine armet, clinging to all the areas that were hard to reach by well-intended polishers. This German sallet was possibly made by Hans Grunwald in Nuremberg. The tail is unusually long and spatulate and is struck with two marks, one of the city of Nuremberg and the other being the armorer's mark, which is in the shape of a horseshoe enclosing a letter. The recessed areas of the marks suggest that this was once finished in the pale gray or blue oxide finish. This sallet was made by Caspar Rieder, who was an Austrian armorer active around the Innsbruck and Mühlau areas between 1452 to 99. This armor now largely presents as a piece of white armor. However, if we look closely at the areas which escaped over-enthusiastic polishing, we can still see the traces of the original oxide finish. The next turn of the century visored bassinet, for the most part, appears in shiny white finish. However, if we examine some of the areas which was covered by the aventail, we can note that there was likely a blue oxide finish at one time. The next series of early bassinet visors may look like white armor at first glance, but when the visors are turned around, we can see the original oxide finish along with the hammer strokes behind which remain intact. As we move into the 16th century, the examples of surviving armor gets better and better preserved, which means the colors become more and more apparent. But before I dive into individual pieces of armor, there is one important piece of historic reference which really shows how colorful armor was when it was produced. The Armour album, produced by German armorer Jakob Hadler, depicts 29 drawings of armor designs on 56 sheets of paper, made throughout 3 decades, between 1557 to 1587. Jakob was first mentioned in 1553 as a hammerman at the Greenwich Workshop in England. We are so fortunate to have these surviving records because it allows us to clearly see the types of armor and, most importantly, the types of color which was being applied to armor at that time. Luckily, most of the armor featured in the Armour album survives to this day, so we can directly compare it to the drawings. It's important to note that all the armor made in Greenwich, which are featured in the Armour album, are high-end pieces, which would have been very exclusive to either the ultra-wealthy or those favored in court. However, this is interesting because these armors offer a counter-argument to those that believe white armor was only made for the upper echelons of society, because they were likely the only people who had a retinue of staff readily available to help keep the armor shiny. There may be some truth to that argument, but there is also ample evidence contradicting this theory, as we have already seen in historic manuscripts and paintings, which shows that colored armor may have been preferred by most, regardless of the socio-economic class they belonged to. Most of the 16th century paintings of wealthy aristocrats are depicted in some sort of colored armor, even in a pale gray oxide finish, rather than white examples. The importance of having some sort of protective colorful oxide finish can be seen in a quote taken from the States Papers Domestic from Queen Elizabeth I in 1567. Which describes payments that were made to paint various corselets black that had become foul and rusty because they had taken salt water in the sea. The cost of refurbishing such rusty armor with black paint was 5 pence per corselet, but to apply a proper grey oxide or russet finish to 17th century corselets without pauldrons, vambraces, or gauntlets was priced anywhere from 4 to 5 shillings. This substantial increase in price shows that it was clearly more labor-intensive to reapply a proper oxide finish than to simply slap on a coat of paint. To give you a better idea of the amount of work involved to re-oxide a proper finish, an account in 1631 describes that the corselet had to be completely dismounted, the surfaces cleaned and recolored, and then the armor was reassembled and relined. Although painted armor had largely fallen out of primary use by the 16th century, it had not completely vanished, as seen here in this northern Italian capucet. The capucet is painted with the winged lion of St. Mark, the symbol of the Serenissima, which means it was likely commissioned for the state of Venice. Gilding too remained in popular use as a means of coloring armor. The extent of the gilding depended upon the armorer, who either used it to provide accents or encased the whole suit in gold. Some of this gilding is really well preserved on pieces which were hidden under other sections of armor. In this example, we can see how most of the gilding has been polished away over the centuries, but if you know where to look for it, it remains much like some of the other traces of colored oxide finishes. Although it looks white now, that was not how they were created or intended to appear. The polishing away of the original color of armor over the centuries has helped give rise to the modern idea that most armor was white. Overzealous polishing has not only removed the original finish of most armors, but it has also destroyed some of the finer details and decorative embellishments some armor used to have, as seen here in this picture, during one of his restorations. The blue oxide is still evident on these elements of armor, attributed to Cristobal de Mondragon of Holland. The original blue is most evident around the collar, in certain areas of the breastplate, which also features beautifully carved designs. This Morian caveset is an excellent example of what most armors would have looked like with a blue oxide finish. It's a miracle that so much of it has survived over the years and has not been polished away. Take a look at this left elbow gauntlet, which is one of a pair. Chris Dobson was tasked with restoring this piece, and during the process discovered this beautiful bright blue oxide finish on the wrist lame, where it had been covered over by the forward part of the long cuff plate. As I zoom in here, take notice of the distinct step or raised portion of the original pale blue finish compared to the exposed portion of plate which has all been polished away. This shows how thick the oxide finish was on historic armor and why such finishes might have been mistaken for a type of vegetable or other organic lacquer, which bad conservation ideas worked hard to eliminate and polish away. This vibrant blue finish is very different from russet gray, black, or midnight blue oxide finishes. I have compared a portion of the gauntlet to this Majolica statue of Francesco Maria I della Rovere, Duke of Urbino. Majolica is a nice medium to offer a comparison to because it does not easily change its color over time. The color of Majolica usually remains vibrant and crisp, and clearly the artist who chose the pigments for the Duke's armor was keenly aware of what shades of color are appropriate in order to render an accurate representation of armor. The color comparison is striking and shows how certain tones of oxide finishes may have appeared. The gray-blue finish on this German armet might have been applied with paint at some point in the past to imitate the original blue-gray oxide finish, which still appears visible around the visor area. Since the overall surface is colored, it does provide us with an opportunity to see with our own eyes how the helmet would have originally appeared. The same holds true for this armet, which appears to have received some paint in an attempt to bring back some semblance of its original color. The next piece, however, is an early 16th century armet executed in the Maximilian style and still retains a beautiful oxide finish. The finish is remarkably intact and adds a deep layer of sophistication to the overall look of the piece. Like the previous Maximilian style of armet we just saw, this astounding closed burgonet of Austrian origin is an excellent example of how a blue oxide finish should look. The pale blue finish is possibly Botticelli blue, and it remains bright and clear despite the passage of time. I have digitally reconstructed a small portion of this burgonet to help people imagine what the helmet would have originally looked like had all of its original oxide finish remained to this day. The next group of armor is very interesting because they feature rare examples of a peacock blue oxide finish. As the name suggests, this type of finish was especially colorful and resembled a peacock or an oil slick in water, reflecting all the colors of the rainbow. Master armorer Chris Dobson made a section of armor with a peacock finish to give us a better idea of what these finishes looked like when they were new. If we take a closer look at this 16th century sallet, we can see remnants of a gray or blue oxide finish in the recessed portions of the cross of St. Andrew's, visible across the ventilation holes in the visor. The cross's perform an X shape, or saltire, was a Burgundian emblem that was adopted by the Habsburgs and used as an insignia by Imperial German troops. The St. Andrew's cross was also adopted by the Scottish. More evidence of the original oxide finish remains around the brass rivets. This 16th century suit of armor had parts possibly made by Hans Michel of Nuremberg, Germany, and it has a dark gray, blue, or black finish with highlighted portions of white armor to add for a detailed contrast. This is a nice example clearly showing the distinction between an oxide finish and a white finish. The 17th century is the last era I will talk about, since it represents the twilight of substantial amounts of armor being used on the battlefields of Europe. Even though the 17th century marks the end of thousands of years of European armor tradition, it did not end with any dramatic changes to the color of it. As you might expect by now, armor remained in the 17th century much as it did before, which is to say, full of color. The heavy cavalry of the day and large segments of infantry were still generally equipped from head to knee in protective armor, as seen here in this example of three-quarter armor. The armor appears to have a gray or light blue oxide finish, heavily embellished with gilded accents. A similar style of finish can be seen on this finely crafted Italian clothes helmet from around 1620. This helmet is of superior quality to most of the period and is greatly distinguished by the fine condition of its original blue oxide surface. The blue has faded, but is remarkably still intact. Even when it came to sieges, armor received the same treatment as any other, as is evidenced by this Italian example shown here. The next siege helmet, which dates from between 1650 to 1700, is extremely thick and heavy and was likely uncomfortable. The adjustable face defense alone weighs almost 4 pounds, which is close to the entire weight of other helmets we have seen. The shallow dent at the front of the bowl is a proof mark. The form of the bowl is curiously archaic, recalling sallets of the 15th century. The bowl and the face defense are both stamped with the number 21, indicating that the helmet was part of a series. What is most important, however, is that the helmet appears to have a russet or dark gray oxide finish present. Curiously, there is also minute traces of a pale blue, possibly Botticelli blue, that is still clinging to tiny portions of the helmet. Whatever the color, it is clear that this helmet was finished in anything but white. In 1625, Gervase Markham, a well-known and high-ranking mercenary soldier fighting in the Low Countries and also under the Earl of Essex's command in Ireland, wrote a valuable publication called The Soldier's Ascendance, or an introduction into military discipline containing the first principles of necessary knowledge meant for captains, muster masters, and all young soldiers of the infantry or foot bands, also the cavalry or forms of training of horse troops, as it has been received from the latest and best experienced armies. A work fit for all noble, generous, and good spirits that love honor and honorable action. In this war treatise, Gervase outlines what types of armor should be used and even the names for a range of different finishes used on armor during this period. Gervase wrote, "All this armor is to be rather russet, sanguine, or black color, than white or mild, for it will keep longer from rust." Here we have it straight from the horse's mouth, from a professional soldier and mercenary, who clearly states that armor must be kept and produced in oxide finishes in order to keep it from becoming rusty like white armor. Basically, this commander is telling his troops to be equipped in anything but white armor. With professionals like this dictating the policy of issued kit to his men, it's hard to imagine that white armor was present on the battlefield in any large numbers, if not entirely absent. We can back up the words of this general with numerous surviving examples of armor with their original finishes intact, such as this burgonet from around the same time period. This beautiful helmet is of the type that would have been worn in the painting we just saw. It is in untouched condition, which helps demonstrate the type of finish Gervase was expecting on his soldiers' armor. This English pikeman's corselet from 1620 to 30 also retains an oxide finish as the dominant color. However, the tassel hinges and shoulder straps, which now appear white, were likely some other color originally as well. The trend continues with this mid-17th century lobster tail burgonet, which still features a portion of its original blue oxide finish. The list of colored armor really just keeps going on and on. It is everywhere we look, from three-quarter suits to individual elements and paintings. It even continues into the 18th century in what is quite possibly the last suit of royal armor ever made in the early 1700s. As no surprise, The main plates of armor were done in a midnight blue oxide finish. This is a fitting finish to what is believed to be the last royal armor made in Europe. Looking back at everything, we have seen many artists using a wide range of mediums with different techniques over a wide span of time, 700 years or more, all depicting antique arms and armor as either black, dark blue-gray, dark gray, pale gray, blue, pale blue, dark blue, azure blue, Botticelli blue, purple, red, sanguine, brown, russet, green, yellow, gold, and yes, sometimes silver or white. What does this tell us? Did all of these people simply get it wrong or refuse to capture accurately what they saw? This seems highly unlikely. So many skilled people could not have been wrong, and to cling to the idea that they simply got the details mixed up is hiding the truth that has been staring us in the face for centuries. It's much more probable that they painted exactly what they were seeing in real life, which is further supported by the physical evidence found on the weapons and armor themselves. The remains of original oxide finishes are now a rarity, but they have not been completely erased by time or well-intended restoration attempts. So if many of our historic texts, painting, and actual armor does not support the theory of knights in shining white armor, then where did the idea of a knight encased in highly polished steel come from? Well, I hate to say it, but it largely came from the Victorians. Authentic medieval armor was still readily available for purchase until the end of the Victorian period. The Victorians were great restorers of many things, and we certainly owe them an awful lot. But when it came to arms and armor, their enthusiasm and can-do attitude might have been a bit of a curse. The Victorians went through various crazes, which caused them to purchase large quantities of historic arms and armor for museums and private collections. These items were then polished up to conform to the current tastes and trends of the time. The Victorians felt that highly polished items displayed better on newly refurbished castle walls, museums, and stately homes, and as such, looked more attractive to buyers. Therefore, an unpolished suit of armor was seen as a less desirable one, so that dull blue or other shade of steel simply had to go. To help show how widespread this new fashion had spread, soldiers garrisoned in the Tower of London, for example, were given a cloth and brick dust so they could polish up the armor in the White Tower. This taste for polished arms and armor continues to this present day, and very few pieces have escaped unscathed, even in the most prestigious collections. So the armor you see in museums, modern books, and photographs on the internet are not likely how they appeared when they were new. Because the idea of the knight in shining armor has become so ingrained in our popular culture that it's very difficult to think of anything else. In fact, a recent publication in 2023 on this subject, called Beaten Black and Blue, The Myth of the Medieval Knight in Shining Armor, written by Master Armourer Chris Dobson, mentions that he met with resistance when he wrote this book for precisely this reason. People did not want to believe that a knight's armor was in most cases not shiny or white armor. That is not to say that white armor did not exist. It most certainly did, and there are some historical manuscripts, paintings, and illuminations to back this up. However, there seems to be just as many, if not more, evidence out there showing that armor came in all sorts of colors, either through the type of oxide finish applied to it or by covering it with leather, silk, velvet, or painting it. What I like about Chris Dobson's argument is that he explores this topic from a solid foundation in restoration and manufacturing antique armor. He has restored antique armor from around the world, from most time periods, and he has a lot of hands-on experience with the real thing. It is from this rich background in restoration that Chris truly began to realize that most of the armor he worked on was not initially white armor. Anyone who has created, restored, conserved, or maintained historic weapons knows how difficult it is to keep iron and steel free from rust. That is the primary reason why manufacturers and clients rarely chose a white finish historically. It simply required too much effort to maintain properly without modern chemicals and power tools, and did not last very long in the field before you had a rusty mess on your hands. This is why military leaders like Jervis Markham equipped his soldiers with non-white armor. White armor just wasn't practical in the early 1600s, and likely never was. Anyway, for those wanting to learn more about this subject, check out Chris Dobson's book. It's a fantastic book, and will provide much more in-depth information on the subject, as well as how some of that beautiful color was achieved. That's it for this episode of Restoring the Past. I hope you have found this topic colorful. I know. But in all seriousness, hopefully you found it interesting, and that it has made you think of antique arms and armor in a different way. Historic arms and armor is a big field to both study and collect. And if you ever find yourself holding a genuine specimen to conserve or restore, try to remember that what may look like tarnish may actually be original oxide finish. So tread carefully, and try not to get roped into the white armor tunnel vision. This episode was also not meant to take anything away from all those who choose to wear white armor in whatever activity that requires it, such as reenactments, historical European martial arts such as HEMA, armored combat, jousting, etc., but hopefully complements these pursuits by offering more diverse forms of armor to wear. The idea of a knight in shining armor is difficult to get away from, since it has become a deeply ingrained image in our popular culture. But like most things in life, the popular image, when compared to the actual reality, are often two different things. Despite all the evidence, many will still find it hard to believe that most knights likely did not wear shiny armor. But the key word here is most knights, not all knights. Some knights did wear shiny armor. I am not trying to deny that important fact. But the point here is that shiny armor might not have been as widespread as we think, and more likely was seen in a variety of hues and colors. Despite this realization, I still find the image of a knight to be awe-inspiring, no matter the color of the armor. This symbol has not changed, and has only further deepened my appreciation for the subject matter, and has helped make me a more conscientious restorer. I will do some videos of antique armor restoration at some point, so stay tuned for those. Let me know what you think of this topic in the comments section, and don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions you might have. I hope you can get out there and enjoy everything that history has to offer. It has been my absolute pleasure bringing this episode to you, and as always, good luck with your projects, and see you next time.